Okay, so let's get a little further into analyzing section B of our piece. And in order to do so, we're going to have a real in-depth conversation about diminished chords, how Beethoven uses them, and what he does to kind of trick our ear into thinking he's in one place, but he's really in another place. And it's a really cool technique you're going to see throughout his whole catalog, and again, much later in this piece too. All right, so one of the most obvious segues into this conversation is this F flat that you see in that line that starts theme B. And where does it come from? Well, the most obvious answer is the chord that we talked about earlier, G diminished 7. F flat is in that chord. Well, how did we arrive at that chord? And is that chord really that chord? So let's go over to Tessitura. And this illustrates quite clearly all the notes that we're going to see in this diminished 7 chord. So as it relates to like diminished 7 chords, one of the really cool things about them is their symmetry, and how this creates this like ambiguity as to what chord are you really on. So if we take G diminished 7, the chord we mapped out earlier in the other app, we can see that on Tessitura, we have G, B flat, D flat, and F flat. So that's a really obvious answer to the earlier question, where does the F flat come from? But something else to be said about this chord is that, as with any diminished 7 chord, any note in the chord can be the root. All right, so I can take G diminished and have it sound like G diminished by rooting it on G diminished, or if I change the root to B flat, I still have the same 4 notes, but now it's a B flat diminished 7 chord. If I move it up to D flat, the root, now I'm on D flat diminished 7, now I'm on E diminished 7. So there's really only 3 diminished 7 chord groupings. All right, that is to say, with 3 separate groupings, you can get all 12 diminished 7 chords that exist. We just got 4 of them right there with this one note grouping, with G, B flat, D flat, and F flat. I can change the root from here and get that to this, to that, to this. So this sort of like ambiguity, like we talked to earlier, really kind of opens the door for Beethoven to do a lot of really cool things and sort of play with you a little bit, sort of have fun with you, to trick you into thinking it's going to do one thing, that you're really here, but you're really there. All right, so having said that, let's go back to mapping Tonal Harmony Pro and get further into where the F flat came from and how we got to G diminished 7 to begin with. Because remember, we're in A flat. Where does G diminished 7 come from? Let's change the map to view some of the secondary dominant chords of our key before we talk about that. So one of the things that makes learning and applying and talking about diminished chords so difficult is the looseness by which you can interpret whether it is this or that, because we just talked about how this 4-note grouping could be this chord, this chord, this chord, or this chord. So which one is it, right? And this sort of interpretation as am I here or am I there can sometimes be answered yes, like you're in both places at the same time. This is pretty clear when you look at like the G diminished 7 chord, and we just talked about a second ago how it's the same exact chord as that one down there, E diminished 7. They have the same exact 4 notes. So when we asked the question earlier, where did G diminished 7 come from? One of the easiest ways to answer that is that we borrowed from our current key, A flat. We borrowed from A flat's parallel minor. We borrowed from A flat minor to get G diminished 7. And how it kind of wants to go there to get that tension release. Once again, going from the dominant region of our map down to the tonic region, right? If I had stayed in A flat major, I wouldn't have gotten that F flat. Wouldn't have gotten that E that we keep talking about. But by borrowing from the minor, Beethoven has introduced that F flat into the chord progression or into the melody. All right. But is it really G diminished 7? What could it be seen as otherwise? Well, it could be seen as E diminished 7, and in which case we're kind of borrowing from the minor key that the A section was in.